Hi, I'm Sam Landsman from Slowboat.com.
And I'm Laura Domela from Slowboat.com. And today we're going to talk to you about the Inside Passage. Why do we continue to cruise the Inside Passage year after year, Sam?
Well, a whole bunch of reasons, really. One is it's an incredibly big, incredibly beautiful, and incredibly accessible cruising ground. And it's quite diverse, too. You can go from big cities like Seattle, Vancouver, Victoria, all the way to the wilderness of Southeast Alaska. Everything from coastal sandy beaches to tidewater glaciers at the head of fjords. And a private boat happens to be one of the best ways to see this area. There's literally thousands of miles of cruising to be done. Sure, you can see it from a ferry or a cruise ship or parts of it this way.
But a lot of it you can't.
Yeah, there's no way to see it more completely than by private boat.
Right.
And to go along with that, it's challenging and it's also rewarding. I can't tell you how rewarding it is for people to pull into Alaska, pull into Ketchikan, clear U.S. Customs after a trip up the whole Inside Passage from Seattle.
Looking back at the map and the area they've covered.
Yep, and realizing you took your little boat all the way from a city to the wilderness out here.
It's actually pretty badass.
It is. There are other reasons, too.
Fishing.
There's great fishing and crabbing the whole length of the Inside Passage. There's tremendous wildlife. That's one of the things that keeps me coming back time and time again. I never get sick of watching bears forage on shore or whales breaching.
You haven't stopped for humpbacks a few times.
Oh, the humpbacks can get a little tiresome in
There's
Alaska,
a lot of humpbacks.
They're like speed bumps almost.
Aww.
Thankfully, we don't run into them often. They're much better at avoiding us, I'm sure, than we are at avoiding them. But the whales, orcas, and gray whales, and humpbacks. Dolphins playing in the bow wave.
Eagles
soaring overhead. All of us have seen these videos on National Geographic of a bear plucking a salmon out of a stream, and watching that with your own eyes. It's like the best HD video that you could imagine.
It's very cool.
And you actually get to see this. I've seen it many times in British Columbia and Alaska. I've seen bears that are so bad at catching fish, they get hit in the side of the face by a jumping fish. And it's so right there in your face. You can't avoid seeing it. And it's one of the big draws of the Inside Passage.
Solitude. It's great to just be out there and hardly see any other pleasure boats, which is a pretty big departure from San Juan Islands in the summer.
Yeah, generally as you go further north, it becomes more and more remote. There are some exceptions to this, but that's a good rule of thumb. And the solitude is you get out to these cruising areas and you're the only boat in anchorage, or maybe you go a full day without seeing another boat. And that's so unlike what we experience in our normal lives. Most of us live in cities or suburbs, and it's pretty incredible to be out totally self-sufficient, totally on your own, and also to see how people live out there. They're mom and pop marinas where they've carved an existence out of the wilderness. They make their own power and water and fall their own timber and then mill it into boards to make their dock.
It makes your city loft living feel pretty wussy.
Yeah, it's a totally different set of challenge.
Yes. All right, so how do I know if my boat is good enough to go to Alaska? I hear this a lot with people talking about, is my boat too small? Is my boat too slow? How do you know if your boat's good enough to travel the Inside Passage?
Well, one of the beauties of the Inside Passage is how well protected it is generally and how accessible services are. So the limiting factor tends to be how comfortable you are on the boat for long periods of times. A boat that you might spend a weekend near Seattle on is not necessarily the same boat you'd want to spend 3 months on taking up to Alaska. With that said, the longest distance between fuel stops is only about 85 nautical miles. If you are really working at it, you can get water and provisions every few days, basically, all the way from Olympia to Juneau, Alaska, Glacier Bay, Alaska. And other than the comfort of your boat, the other big factor is the condition that your boat's in. So you want a boat that's seaworthy. You don't want to be doubting the
mechanics.
Yeah, whether the engine or the steering or any of the equipment on board is going to work. It needs to be well maintained, and you need to understand how the boat works. And this is increasingly important as you move north and get off the beaten path.
Right. That said, race to Alaska.
Yeah.
They go in kayaks, right?
Yeah, they do take kayaks up. I've heard of somebody trying to take a paddleboard up. I'm not sure if they made it.
Right. And that's from Puget Sound to Ketchikan, right?
Yeah, that's the whole length of the Inside Passage in British Columbia. This boat here is a 22-foot sea dory that I've taken from Anacortes up to Glacier Bay and back, and took it around Vancouver Islands. That's a lightly built 22-foot planing hulled powerboat with a 90-horse outboard and 50 gallons of gas.
So we just returned to that first bullet. How comfortable are you living aboard
said
boat for weeks at a time? Yeah.
Are you going to be warm and dry? That's something that's a big deal, especially not just warm temperature-wise, but dry. How are you going to deal with condensation on board? How are you going to store enough perishable food for maybe 5 or 6 days between grocery stores? How are you going to have enough water on board so that you're not constantly worrying about running out? And you can tailor an Inside Passage trip to the capabilities of almost any boat. And it's just important to go into it with the understanding what your boat is capable of, how comfortable you are in the boat, and that will probably dictate how far you go.
Okay, what about sail versus power?
Both are fine choices. I've seen a lot of both along the Inside Passage.
Sailboats, we hear they don't really get to sail much, but that's really the only...
Yeah, even the most aggressive sailors seem to only sail about 10% of the time if they're on a multi-month trip from Puget Sound or lower British Columbia up to Alaska.
And this is because of the protected
It's
area.
generally not that windy, often narrow channels or relatively narrow channels, and people talk about the noserlies as the dominant weather pattern. No matter what direction you're going, the wind always seems to be right on your bow. And so in a narrow channel, it can be a lot of work to sail upwind.
Yay, protected. Oh, no wind.
The other thing about sailboats is typically they have an outside helm station. And in the summer when it's nice out, that might be fine. But if you're going north where it gets rainier, you're cruising in the shoulder season or off season, being out in the elements while underway is not super comfortable. I actually had a couple with about a 45-foot, fairly new sailboat. They'd shipped it up from Texas where they lived, and they came up to Alaska on it, and they wore their ski suits most of the trip from Anacortes up to Ketchikan. They came back from that trip and traded in for a pilot house powerboat. They didn't sail much, and they were cold and wet most of the time.
Okay, let's get on to the rest of our presentation.
The map on the left shows the entire Inside Passage, and each of those red boxes highlights one of the specific cruising areas. And so you can see with these boxes that these areas we'll talk about are not equally sized. There's some areas like the San Juan Islands, which are pretty small, and then we talk about Southeast Alaska, which is huge. So this map will continue to appear on the left side of the presentation. We'll give you a little idea of scale in these cruising areas we talk about. It's about 1,000 nautical miles from Olympia, Washington up to Glacier Bay, Alaska. That's, for most people, several months of cruising. That's a one-way distance. You're going to do a lot of side trips too, probably. That's one of the charms of
You should do a lot of side trips,
There's
right?
so much to see. I tell people if you're going to do an Alaska trip, it's probably not going to be any less than 2,000 nautical miles, and it's very likely that it's going to be somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 nautical miles. And that in a 2 to 5 month cruising season. But the other thing to think about is there's a lot to see that's not Alaska. We don't want to get so trapped in this thought of just moving north and north and north that we skip the wonderful places to see that are closer to the population centers and where most of the boats are kept. So there's not a bad section of the Inside Passage. It's all beautiful. It all has its own merit. There are good reasons to explore all these different regions. So not only is the Inside Passage mostly protected, but it also has services available throughout its entire length. So you're never more than probably a few hundred miles from a real mechanical help, and you're a lot closer than that to most other things you need. Fuel is available every 85 miles or so. Water and marinas are available, normally with some kind of a small store, at least every few days, and often more frequently than that. It can be very remote, but you're not necessarily out in the wilderness all the time. You can decide where you want to go and how remote you want to be versus how much marina time.
Right, you've just got a couple of little crossings that are...
Yeah, and we think of those as gates. These are the things you have to get around or get through in order to see the next protected cruising area.
Right.
And none of these gates are particularly difficult, and with patience and a little bit of a weather eye, you can normally get through without any difficulty at all. But it's a hallmark of Pacific Northwest cruising is this big protected area with great cruising, and then you have to hop across something or around something to get to the next cruising area.
Well, let's go ahead and start with the most southern part, Puget Sound. For many people who live in the Pacific Northwest, this will be the most familiar area, but for those of you who haven't explored much down here, they're really great spots to visit by boat.
I think it's important to emphasize that there's really no bad section of the Inside Passage.
Yeah.
So people tend to try to move north very quickly, and it's all about how far north you get. But don't overlook the areas close to home and realize that there are tons of good places to see even if you don't have an entire summer to go cruising. So in Puget Sound, there are a lot of highlights. Tacoma, surprisingly, for people that have lived in the Northwest for a long time, Tacoma had a questionable reputation for a while, but it's really reinvented itself. The Theophos Waterway is an excellent destination. There are a lot of urban destinations in Puget Sound, so Seattle too, Bell Harbor Marina.
We love staying at Bell Harbor, right downtown. It's so great. You're a short walk from Pike Place. You've got this gorgeous city view.
There's lots of small towns that are great to visit too. There's Langley and Paulsbo and
Port
Townsend, yeah, and so many more.
We're really just scratching the surface by giving you a quick overview here.
Yeah, so we'll have more detailed information in presentations that are specific to each of these areas, but this is just try to give you the flavor of each cruising area. There are also a lot of state marine parks in Puget Sound. There's Blake Island just across Elliott Bay from Seattle, and south of Tacoma Narrows there are a whole bunch of state parks, Hope Island and McMicken Island, and these state parks are often deserted in the peak summer season. Everybody's gone north, so it's a nice way to explore Puget Sound. For those that aren't familiar, there is an annual pass you can buy for the Washington State Parks.
The moorage permit is $5 per foot with a minimum of $60.
And that's good for an entire year. So then you can use the state parks, either the buoys or the docks,
Right. If you're over 45 feet, you can't moor on the buoys, only 45 feet and under, but there's lots of docks and linear moorage that you can use.
If you're going to be cruising in Puget Sound or the San Juan Islands much and using the state marine parks, it's a great thing to have. And one of the other great things about Puget Sound is Mount Rainier. It's so close, especially as you move further south, and it's a pretty commanding presence throughout Puget Sound on a clear day.
It's funny, this area is so populated, and so you think about it as a big city area, and one of the hardest things to do is find groceries in Puget Sound when you're traveling by boat.
Yeah, a lot of the marinas are not near grocery stores. So in places like Seattle and Tacoma, Gig Harbor, and there's no grocery store within easy walking distance of the marina that you'll likely be tied up at. There are other places like Eagle Harbor and Bainbridge Island and Port Townsend and Langley that are easy to get groceries at, but it's good to know those resources going into it.
Great.
One of the other challenges in Puget Sound is the amount of shipping traffic. There are traffic lanes that run north-south, and a lot of your routes will take you across those lanes, and you have to be aware of the traffic. There are a lot of ferry runs. We're recording this just a few days after a now famous incident with a boat called Nap Time and a Washington State ferry colliding down near Tacoma.
Oops.
So don't do that.
Day alert.
One of the other big challenges is there's a lot of private land. So even if you do anchor somewhere, unless it's a park, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to go ashore anywhere.
Okay, let's move north now and head to the San Juan Islands.
Yeah, the San Juans are world famous, and rightly so. They're a beautiful area. There's a tremendous natural beauty here. It really feels like you can be off-grid in some of the places in the San
It really
Juans.
does, yeah.
Particularly some of the state marine parks, Sush Island, Meisha Island, and Paytos Island.
And the hiking is great.
Yeah, they're beautiful. There's lots of hiking. There are no buildings on shore. You can be at anchor and not see houses everywhere, which is a nice change of pace.
Lots of good wildlife.
Yep, the orcas are often around. There are several resident pods, and they're not there all the time, but they're spotted pretty routinely in the San Juan Islands.
The first place we ever saw humpbacks was out by Paytos Island.
There are a few challenges also in the San Juans. In the summer, it's pretty crowded. Going to a lot of the marinas, you'll need to have reservations. You might be competing for limited mooring buoys or dock space at the state park. And if you're anchored somewhere that is not a state park, then you'll probably have difficulty going ashore. Most of the land is private if it's not a state park. And one of the other challenges is just getting to the San Juans. It requires a little bit of navigation, either going across the Strait of Juan de Fuca, if you go the outside route, going through Deception Pass, which is an area where the current can run up to about 8-9 knots, or going through Swinomish Channel, which is a narrow, shallow, swift-moving channel. None of these are particularly difficult, but we've got another video where you can learn about getting to the San Juans from somewhere south.
Perfect. Okay, we're feeling bold. We've explored the San Juans and we want to cross the border into British Columbia.
Yep, hopefully you've watched our video on crossing the Canadian border and entering Canada. If not, there's a link to it here. And the Gulf Islands are a beautiful, big,
so pretty,
relatively big cruising area compared to the San Juans. And there are so many highlights. It's hard to mention them all in this short format.
We really like Ganges Harbor on Salt Spring Island.
Yep, Salt Spring Island is a great destination. Ganges is beautiful. There's a ton of food options there. There's good restaurants. There's a great farmer's market.
Newcastle Island is fun. It's right across from Nanaimo. And so you've got this cool city view, but you're moored out along this little provincial marine park island, and you can take your dinghy over to the Dinghy Dock pub, which is only accessed by boat, little boat, dinghies, in fact, and little water taxis that come across from Nanaimo. And it's great.
Yeah, and there are also some great provincial marine parks, places like Wallis Island.
Right.
And there's good urban cruising too. If you go down to Victoria, it's not in the Gulf Islands proper, but it's in that same region. Victoria, of course, is the provincial capital of British Columbia.
It's beautiful.
Very Victorian style.
Good fish and chips.
Now, the Gulf Islands are diverse. You have everything from pretty remote feeling parks to urban destinations like Victoria and Nanaimo. There are, of course, like in any of these places, some challenges. Summers are very busy in the Gulf Islands. You might be, just like in the San Juans, you could be competing for limited moorage space. And then Dodd Narrows is a tidal narrow that you have to navigate if you're going to get up to Nanaimo.
Okay, I always hear people talking about how scary Dodd Narrows. I'd be really careful about Dodd Narrows, and it doesn't seem scary at all.
Yeah, Laura, the thing here to remember is that tidal rapids are to be respected, not feared. They're incredibly predictable. We know years in advance when you can go through safely. At a place like Dodd Narrows, you actually have a fair bit of leeway in a boat that has a little bit of power. You don't have to be there right at slack. I'm not advocating for going in conditions when it's really running, but you can cheat Dodd Narrows a fair bit. And
I remember on our way south last year, I texted you, okay, we're at Dodd Narrows and it's running this much against us. Is it that scary? And you're like, no, go.
It uses it as an opportunity to keep the turbo well used on the engine. But in the Gulf Islands video, we talk more about Dodd Narrows specifically, but Dodd Narrows is not something to be scared of.
Okay, great. So now we're in Nanaimo. Normally you could go up if you wanted to go to Comox, or you could cross over to the mainland side, which means the Strait of Georgia.
Yes, and the Strait of Georgia is one of the areas that tends to scare people the most. It's a big gate on the way up to somewhere further north.
We've had our worst conditions ever in the Strait of Georgia, counting Alaska, counting Dixon Entrance, everything.
It's a very big body of water. It's
a lot of fetch.
There's a ton of fetch. It's about 20 miles across, and it can kick up and be horrible, but it's not always horrible. A lot of the time it's actually quite calm. And so
we've had that too.
This is one of those things where you just have to wait for the weather to be appropriate. Environment Canada issues forecasts for the Strait of Georgia. There are a couple of weather buoys that are available, Lightkeeper reports. And for more about crossing the Strait of Georgia, we have a whole video specifically about that. The one other thing to think about when you're going across the Strait of Georgia that tends to scare people is Area Whiskey Gulf, which is right outside of Nanaimo. It's on the normal path you'd take from Nanaimo across to, say, Pender Harbor. And it is a Navy test zone. They do torpedo testing and so forth. The torpedoes are not armed, but they get very particular if you try to drive your boat through their test range. So the east side of the Strait of Georgia has some excellent cruising and very diverse cruising too. Everything from urban cruising, like in Vancouver, where you can
just did that, right?
Yeah, and you can actually anchor right in False Creek. It's
cool.
Free. It's a super cool place to be anchored, very different than any other anchorage in the Pacific Northwest. You're right in the middle of Vancouver. You can take your dinghy to Granville Island and market. You can take your boat all the way up to Squamish, almost to Whistler.
Wow, cool.
And there's not a lot of moorage up there. A little bit further north, you have Pender Harbor and Egmont and Skookumchuck Rapids and Princess Louisa Inlet. Princess Louisa Inlet is one of the finest destinations on the entire coast. It's a huge fjord just with a spectacular waterfall at the head of it. And it's world class. And then you go up to Lund, and that's
we love Lund.
Yep, Lund is the end of the highway.
Or the beginning.
It's a neat small town right at kind of the door to Desolation Sound.
A lot of fish boats come in and out of there. There's a great bakery. Nice
Nancy's
little general
Bakery
store.
is outstanding.
Right. And right around the corner from Desolation Sound.
Yep. And Desolation Sound is one of the quintessential Northwest cruising destinations. People strive for Desolation Sound for many years often, and rightly so. It's a beautiful place, very remote feeling. The currents converge around Vancouver Island in Desolation Sound, and so there's not much exchange of water there.
It's perfect for kayaking. It's so beautiful.
And the water by the end of the summer gets really warm.
Cool.
You can have salt water in the mid 70 degree range or warmer, and so you can actually go swimming. It's one of the few places where you can go relatively comfortably swimming in the salt water in the Northwest.
It also gets pretty crowded in the summer, right?
Yep, July and August, from about Canada Day until the end of August, it can be very crowded in Desolation Sound. So crowded that you have to stern tie a lot of the times when you're anchored. There's just not enough space for all the boats to swing. And so despite the name Desolation Sound, it is not particularly desolate.
We've been through in September, I think, the last 2 years, and there's still quite a few boats there in September. Okay, so we're moving north up to Johnstone Strait. You've got two ways to go, right, to get further north. Going through the rapids or going Johnstone Strait.
Yeah, there are actually several variations on this. At some point, you're going to have to go into Johnstone Strait if you're going to go north from Desolation Sound into the Broughtons. But you can minimize that to about 12 miles if you take the back route through the sets of rapids. And
Which sounds scary, but they are no big deal, I promise.
The rapids are scary for people, and rightly so, I think. They need to be respected. They are potentially hazardous. They're boats that have been lost in the rapids.
Right, but if you time it right, which is not hard, and you run them near slack when you should, you'll be surprised at how calm they are.
Yeah, there is no mystery to the timing of the rapids. It's published. You can look it up, and I can tell you a year from now what time on what day you're supposed to go through the rapids. And so in a lot of ways, the rapids are a lot easier than the other gates that are dependent on weather, because weather
They're predictable.
The weather is unpredictable.
Right.
And so you just have to run these rapids near slack, and they're no big deal. I've taken flotilla groups through, and we get to Dent Rapids, and I get a call on the radio.
Ooh.
I get a call on the radio that says, "You said we were going through rapids.
Yeah.
Where are the rapids?" And so that's how a transit should be. If you time it right, you won't even know that you're going through rapids.
Perfect. And then what about Johnstone Strait? What's its deal?
Johnstone Strait is another area that's much feared, but does not need to be feared. A couple reasons for why it's so feared among boaters. It's narrow, but it's long, and it tends to funnel wind through. particularly in the afternoon. It's not uncommon to have 25 to 35 knots of wind on a summer afternoon. Mornings are often calm. You're only out there if you take the back way for about 12 miles. So even in the Slowboat, that's only a few hours. And then you're back into protected water in the Broughtons. So Johnstone Strait, again, needs to be respected but not feared.
Okay, so you just mentioned the Broughtons, and that's now where we will be.
Yep, the Broughtons is kind of the next big cruising area on your way north. And it's a wonderful place. It's a little bit bigger than Desolation Sound and much less crowded. It tends to be filled with people who are out for a summer rather than a couple of week vacation.
Right. People a lot of times will just make it their destination and they just stay in the Broughtons all summer, right? Okay. There's a community that all seem to know each other because they've spent years cruising the Broughtons every summer together.
Yeah, and I think the mom and pop marinas in the Broughtons really foster this environment. So there are 5 or 6 of these family-run, family-owned marinas where the people that are grabbing your lines when you arrive are the owner, and they're delivering you a cinnamon roll in the morning and cooking you dinner at night. It's kind of a couple running the whole show, and people build relationships there, and it's a really fun part about cruising up there.
It's a cool community, yeah.
It is. Part of this cruising community is happy hour. These marinas tend to host a happy hour every afternoon or evening.
Afternoon,
yeah. It can start early.
It can.
And every boat brings something to share, an appetizer, or and you bring your own drink and sit around inside or outside depending on the weather and enjoy chatting. So it's really a way of life in the Broughtons, and this is both a blessing and a curse. If you're there for more than a few days,
that's a lot of happy hour.
Yeah, your check liver light may come on.
Right.
The Broughtons are incredibly naturally beautiful. There's very few structures on shore. There's periodic fish farms or logging operations, but you don't see many houses.
It's pretty remote feeling.
It feels like you're out there, which is pretty cool.
The weather's a little bit different, right? As we go north, it's a little bit colder than Desolation Sound.
Yeah, it seems like partway through Johnstone Strait, a switch gets flipped and the weather is several degrees colder and rainier than it is in Desolation Sound. The water is not anywhere near as warm because there's a lot more regular tidal exchange in the Broughtons.
Okay, so let's move out of the Broughtons then, and let's think about going more north. So we've got a couple of places that we advise people stop to fuel up and provision, and really that's kind of it on the northern Vancouver Island part as you head up the Inside Passage, right?
Yeah, the north end of Vancouver Island is a great place to reconvene and get all your ducks in a row before you head north into really remote cruising. So Port Hardy and Port McNeill are good places to get fuel, fill up your water tank, provision, and then wait for a weather window to head around Cape Caution.
Okay, so now we're at the Cape Caution. What's the deal with Cape Caution?
Cape Caution is perhaps the scariest single area for boaters in the Northwest. With a name like Cape Caution.
Why is it so scary?
Well, it's exposed to the Pacific Ocean. So if you want to go north of Vancouver Island, you have to go out into the ocean.
Right. And this is why we meet so many people in Desolation Sound and the Broughtons who have never been north because of Cape Caution.
Yep, and Cape Caution can be horrible, but just like any other of these places, it can be pretty much flat calm. You'll almost always have a little bit of a ground swell.
Right.
And
but swells are kind of fun.
Yeah, I find that it's like a slow motion elevator ride, kind of. And I find that boaters who are used to boating on the East Coast or California are much more used to the swells than Northwest boaters.
True.
Because we're always in protected water for the most part. And so this is for most people that have been boating in the Pacific Northwest, Cape Caution will be their first taste of ocean swells. That's not to say it's always rough, though. Look, this picture I took with the drone last summer heading up, and it was calm enough for me to fly the drone from my bathrobe on top of the boat.
And you were by yourself, right? You were driving the boat and flying the drone.
I was not by myself. I had somebody else to watch the helm. I don't want to fall overboard flying the drone and watch my boat drive away from me and run into Cape Caution. Yeah, going around Cape Caution is a pretty long day for most boats. It can be about 80 miles from someplace like Port McNeill, say, to Fury Cove. That's a pretty common route. Only about half that distance is actually out in the ocean. So a lot of that is in relatively well-protected Queen Charlotte Strait.
Right.
And then you pop out into the ocean. You're out there for about 40 miles, and then you're into Fitzhugh Sound. And so your exposure, even in an 8-knot boat, is still measured in hours. It's a morning trip. It's not multi-day. It's not like you're crossing an ocean here. There's good weather forecasting, good weather resources to figure out what current conditions are. So it's not like you're out here for days at a time. You're out here for a few hours, and then you're back into the protection of the Inside Passage.
Okay, great. All right, so now that we're past Cape Caution, let's talk about the central and northern BC coast. There's so much to explore up here.
Yeah, and I think
You'll notice this area on the map is huge compared to our others, right?
Yeah, the central and northern BC coast, we talk about it like one area, but it's as big as everywhere else we've talked about combined. So it's absolutely massive. You could spend a lifetime just exploring the central northern BC coast. And there's so much to see. One thing that you won't see here is urban destinations.
Right.
Biggest town is Prince Rupert, and that's population somewhere around 15,000. So it's a very remote feeling. It's massive. There's more wildlife, and then there's a real diversity of cruising too. There's sandy beaches out at places like Pruth Bay, and then there's fjords into Fjordland and everything in between.
Natural hot tubs at Bishop Bay, or
yep, there's several natural hot springs that you can go to. It's just a wonderful cruising destination.
Okay, so you're in this pretty remote area. What kind of challenges do you face?
The remoteness is the biggest challenge. Just in the it's hard to get parts if you need it. It's hard to get mechanical help if you need it. It really requires that you be self-sufficient.
Right.
Everything's more difficult. Getting rid of garbage is harder. Buying food is harder. You just need to go into it knowing that, and as long as you do and you have a boat that's well set up, then it's a wonderful place to explore.
Then you're pretty happy because it's beautiful. Okay, so I know we just breezed right through that to get to Dixon Entrance here. We're probably at Prince Rupert, where we can wait for a good weather window to cross Dixon Entrance, get groceries, do whatever. So why don't you tell us some more about Dixon Entrance and what to be careful of and what to think about?
Yeah, Dixon Entrance is very similar to Cape Caution. It's a little shorter, your exposure to the ocean, but it's still about 40 miles that you're out in the ocean. I've gone across when it's just flat as can be. The boat was just totally stable. There's no motion.
I think every crossing of Dixon has been just flat. It's been so great.
Mm-hmm. And so if you pick your weather, it's easy. You'll think, what's the big deal?
Yep.
You're probably going to have some ocean swells going across, but it can be very benign. And then halfway across, you enter Alaska.
Woohoo! So you have crossed Dixon Entrance safely, and you are now in Ketchikan. You've got the whole entire area of Southeast Alaska to explore, and it might not seem that big, but it's huge and it feels endless.
Well, yeah, Southeast Alaska, again, is an area that is massive. It's at least as big as the whole area inside of Vancouver Island, probably bigger, and it's incredibly diverse. You have everything from low-lying coastal scrub kind of stuff that you see in the windswept areas to incredible fjords with glaciers at the head of the fjords. And actually, I think that's one thing that really differentiates Southeast Alaska from cruising everywhere else in the Pacific Northwest.
Height.
Height and ice. It's the only tidewater glaciers are in Southeast Alaska along the Inside Passage.
It just seems like the more north you get, the taller everything is and the more grand and the more spectacular. And it's not to diminish the beauty in the Broughtons or Desolation Sound or anything, but man, Alaska is pretty spectacular.
Yeah, cruising in Southeast Alaska is truly outstanding. There's a reason why it's so popular among general tourists on cruise ships and other ecotourism types of things. Glaciers, bears, and whales pretty much sums it up. They're brown bears and black bears and humpback whales and Bergie bits and calving glaciers. It's just magical.
Also interesting in Alaska is the native culture.
You guys have been to Kasan now a couple of times, right?
We went last year and they were working on restoring the only Haida longhouse left in the United States. They invited us to come back this summer for the dedication and celebration, and it was spectacular. It was so cool. All of these canoes arrive and there's dancing and a feast, and it was wonderful. There's just so much to learn if you're interested in native culture.
The fishing and crabbing is also pretty exceptional in Southeast Alaska. There's a reason why a lot of our seafood in the lower 48 comes from Alaska, not necessarily Southeast.
Because it's delicious.
There is a ton of salmon. Even if you're not into fishing yourself or crabbing yourself, you can trade for it on the docks with the fishermen or buy it from guys at the dock. The fishing and crabbing is a highlight for a lot of people up there.
There's usually a boat in port selling crab or salmon or something. And
of course, cruising in Southeast Alaska is not without challenges. A couple of big challenges here. One is the weather. It's particularly rainy in Southeast Alaska. Just a point of reference, Ketchikan gets more rain in its driest month than Seattle gets in its wettest month. So if you think November in Seattle is bad, you're not ready for July in Ketchikan. The other challenge is the distances are incredibly long.
Right.
I take flotillas up every summer, and the feedback I get from people often is, awesome trip, it was amazing, but we didn't know how far it was.
Yeah, and it's really far.
3 months of moving your boat 20 to 40 miles every day is a long time.
Luckily, it's beautiful.
It is. 20 to 40 miles will take you anywhere you want to go in the San Juan Islands, and that's just a normal day for an Alaska cruise.
Also, the marinas are mostly working marinas and not pleasure boat marinas like they are. You know.
Don't expect to tie up and have people coming out to help you with your power cord and grab your lines and pump your sewage and so forth. These are workboat facilities, and we're there just as kind of an added bonus.
For us, not them, really. Also, there's limited shore access, so if you've got pets with you, that can be tricky because bears, getting in, hiking and stuff. You've got to be prepared for wildlife. And that's a little bit to stop some people like me occasionally from hiking on shore because bears.
Southeast Alaska is such a wonderful place, but there's some other places that actually in a lot of ways feel more remote. And one of
Haida
those,
Gwaii,
one of those is Haida Gwaii, which lies off the coast of British Columbia.
You went last summer, right?
I went a couple summers ago, and it lies across Hecate Strait from the mainland, and so it's about 75 to 100 miles, depending on which route you take, across Hecate Strait out to Haida Gwaii. And it's an incredible place. The Haida culture is alive and well. There are Haida heritage sites, and part of the Haida culture is that as the totems fall, they don't raise them back up. They're returning to earth. And so these totems were falling all over, particularly at a place down at the south end called Skungwai, and it's actually a UNESCO World Heritage Site, but the totems are falling, and it's only a matter of time before they're gone completely. And so it's really something to see.
Cool to see
now while you can. There are very few cruisers that go out there. One of the challenges is you have to deal with a permitting process for the park. It's hard to get fuel and water and supplies. There's no services for pleasure boaters, really.
Well, and you had a little bit of tough weather, right, when you took your boat out?
Yeah, it was beautiful and sunny the whole time, but it was windy from the north, and so it made getting to some of the Haida heritage sites very difficult. So
and are you anchored, or is there an anchorage?
You're anchored the entire...
Okay.
Except for a few towns, anchoring is the only moorage option in Haida Gwaii. So it's definitely for the experienced cruiser. It's off the beaten path, but it's incredibly rewarding and a beautiful, unique area.
Okay, Sam, so what about the west coast of Vancouver Island?
So the west coast of Vancouver Island is a fantastic cruising area. It's big, encompasses 5 protected sounds, and then you'll have open ocean hops between each of those sounds. And those hops work out to be about 20 to 50 miles per hop. So they're pretty achievable in a morning of calm weather. But then once you're into these protected sounds, the weather can be windy and stormy outside, and it has very little bearing on what you're doing inside.
I would imagine there aren't that many people who do this west coast.
No, it tends to be fairly remote, not a lot of cruising boats out there. Paradoxically, a lot of very small fishing boats, so 20 to 24-foot trailer fishing boats. And these fishing boats trailer out to the west side, they launch, and then they run offshore every day, go salmon fishing or halibut fishing, and come back in. It's interesting that cruisers tend to worry a lot about going out into the ocean, but these small open fishing boats have no qualms about it, even in some pretty nasty weather. The other thing about the west side of Vancouver Island is it tends to be more popular area among sailboats. The conventional wisdom is that the northwesterly winds blow every afternoon during the summer. That's not entirely true, but assuming that is more true than not, you have a lot of downwind sailing on a counterclockwise trip around Vancouver Island. There tend to be a lot of sailboats out there. They sail between the sounds, and then they enjoy cruising in the sounds for a few days and then move on to the next one. There are a lot of sandy beaches accessible out on the west side of Vancouver Island too. There are beaches where the ocean swells just continue to pound in all year long, and they're beautiful sandy beaches with surf. The Tofino area is popular among surfers, and the Canadian Coast Guard does a lot of their rigid hull inflatable boat operator training out on the west side of Vancouver Island. It's pretty consistently rough in places, and so it's a good place for them to do that training.
Tofino feels like a cross between Southern California and Alaska to me.
Yeah, Tofino is a great town, especially if you're coming from north to south. It's the first town you're going to come to on the west side of Vancouver Island that really feels populated and energetic, and there's more going on than local fishing and logging. And it's a very popular tourist destination this summer. Not a great boat destination. There's not much moorage, and there's strong currents out there, so it can be a little bit challenging to moor, but a great destination.
So what are some general challenges about the west coast of Vancouver Island?
The weather and ocean conditions are probably the biggest challenge. Between each of these sounds, and then to get out to the west side, you're going around Cape Scott, and to get back, you have to go through the whole length of the Strait of Georgia. And so you have probably 7 days of your trip around Vancouver Island is going to be in the ocean, or have ocean conditions. And so if we compare that to a trip up to Alaska, for instance, a round trip to Alaska, you'd only probably have about 4 days that you're out in the ocean at all. So there's more ocean time when you're out on the west side of Vancouver Island. But again, these are short hops. You're out for a morning typically, and then you're back into the protected water.
So about how long a trip if you decided you want to circumnavigate Vancouver Island?
That's a good question, and it really spans. For sailboat racers, there's a Van Isle 360 sailboat race, and they do it in a week or less. And I've done 2 months out there and didn't get bored or feel like I was going too slowly. So I would say that a month would be a reasonable length of time for a circumnavigation of Vancouver Island, but you can also go out and start from the south, go out the Strait of Georgia and just go up to Barkley Sound. That's the southernmost of the sounds, and then you could go out for a much shorter trip. You don't have to complete a circumnavigation of Vancouver Island to see and experience the west side of the island.
Okay, great.
So thanks for listening. We have more in-depth videos of all of these cruising areas, and if you want to explore in more detail, that's a great place to start. We're also happy to answer any questions you might have.
And thanks for joining us. To see more of our educational boating videos, subscribe to our Slowboat YouTube channel. If you're on Facebook, you can follow us at facebook.com/slowboatlife. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at slowboatlife. And of course, you can always find us on slowboat.com. Until next time, see you on the water.